Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful episode on Health for Niger. My name is Dr. Ngozi Onuoha, and I'm the founder of Health for Niger. Here we provide health awareness, inspiration, education. So today we have a wonderful speaker. I'm going to introduce her. Her name is Lamya Broussard. She is a certified trauma-informed licensed social worker and a healer and wellness and lifestyle advocate. She is the founder of C.O.M.E, which stands for Come Out More Equipped Consulting Services. Welcome, Lamya.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ngozi. Thanks for having me.
It's so nice. I know we scheduled this some weeks ago, right?
Yeah. Time flies.
It does, right?
Yes.
It does. So today you're going to be talking to us about a very important topic, and that's the definition and distinction of grief and trauma. So before we start, go ahead and tell the audience a little bit about yourself, what you do, and then we can dive into today's topic.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a certified trauma-informed licensed social worker. I've been in the social services field for about 16 years. I absolutely love it. It's my calling in life, my purpose. I work also in the school districts, providing as a grief clinician, grief support to the students all throughout Philadelphia, day in and day out. So I deal with grief every day, working, like I said, in all of the different schools in Philadelphia for a private nonprofit. And then I'm also the VP of Operations and Resident Therapist for Caribbean Community in Philadelphia, where we provide services in 8 different parts to our immigrant community, especially our Black immigrants. I've worked with various populations. I've worked with elders. I've worked with foster care. I've worked with youth with co-occurring disorders. When I first came into the field as a resident therapist, and I also work with LGBTQIA plus youth, homeless youth. So I'm just trying to do my part, Dr. Ngozi, and making sure that I'm able to show up and provide and support, as much as my community as I can. I've also been able to represent my job on a national level at different podcasts, and just finished doing the National Alliance for Children's Grief conference in Orlando, Florida, on a panel. So, I like I said, though, it's my calling. I love it. And I just enjoy, having platforms like this to be able to share, some nuggets and to learn as well.
Yeah, this is amazing work, what you're doing. And I think more so, especially during this pandemic, where we've seen people lose loved ones. So the work you're doing is incredible, and I think very timely during this period. So I look forward to learning from you. I always enjoy having guests on the podcast because I always learn something new.
Mm-hmm.
So, go ahead and tell me a little bit more about the trauma versus grief,
Mm-hmm.
and how you would define it,
Mm-hmm.
and what is the impact on wellness?
Right, absolutely. So and coming out more equipped consulting services, we have 4-part program where we look at healthy lifestyle, healthy living, healthy well-being, which is the emotional, mental, spiritual, social part, healthy relationships, and healthy eating. And underneath healthy well-being, in that area, in providing different programming and things like that for the community. I'm glad you asked that, because grief and trauma are not necessarily the same. So just because someone is grieving does not mean that they are traumatized. Every trauma someone goes through doesn't mean necessarily that they are grieving. Grief is definitely, though, an integral part, though, of trauma, because grief is simply the process, natural, normal, human process that each and every last one of us go through when we've had someone die in our life or had a significant loss. And again, that process is the emotional, the physical, the spiritual, the social, the psychological process that we go through. Trauma, the best way I kind of like to use it in like an equation. Trauma, if you're trying to remember, trauma is a word that we've seen, not always cross and transfer over into different cultures. And so where the word trauma may not in the African community, in the Caribbean community, may not be known or what you can put a finger on and say, oh, okay, yeah, I've heard that. But usually when you describe it, it's like, oh, absolutely. Because trauma looks at when an event happens, is subjective, first of all, because what may be traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you. So trauma is, if you want to think of like an event or incident that happened, plus a response that you have, plus the impact. And so if someone gets in a car accident, that could be traumatic for them. And if they find that that is impacting them of wanting to ride in cars, wanting to even see a car, wanting to drive a car, that then is usually where you would say, okay, that's a trauma for them in their life. But I think it's very important that we see people beyond just their trauma, right. Because again, it's an experience you went through. It is that has a response and then has impacts. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, the wellness impacts. And just to back up to, as you mentioned, Dr. Ngozi, it's a lot our people are dealing with right now.
Right.
It's a lot, as you mentioned, of death we've had, of losses of different kinds, whether it's immigrant loss, that can be simply falling out of status during the pandemic, literally because we know it was unforeseen. So we had businesses, you had government agencies, USCIS closing down, right. Shutting down, persons who were right at the cusp of receiving a green card or even just being processed, statuses lapsed. And so that's an example of immigrant loss.
Right.
Another type of loss, or I would say, grief. A few different ones I kind of wanted to highlight could be what's called disenfranchised grief. So that is the grief that we go through that is not validated by society. This can cover miscarriages. We know what's happening with abortion and everything, but miscarriages, where sometimes society doesn't really quite acknowledge that as a grief. Some people want to compare griefs,
right.
That loss of a miscarriage is not the same as losing a child who was 5 years old. No, it can definitely impact someone the very same way. Right. So we can't ever, compare. Also, it can look like, what we saw with Black Lives Matter, just not being validated, Black pain, Black suffering, police brutality, that's disenfranchised. So basically any type of loss that is not validated by society. Another one that I wanted to mention, type of grief, is what we would call, when you have like compounded losses or accumulated. So this is the one where we're seeing in the community happening where, okay, so in the pandemic, you may have lost your health. So you were sick. Now, because you're sick and you can't work, now if you was hospitalized, now you're in the hospital. So then you lose your job. Then you lose your health insurance. Right. Then after that, you lose your home. And so these are like accumulated losses. So when losses are occurring one after the other for a certain period of time. Yeah,
like a cascade, like exactly. A sort of reaction that, that is a cascade, and you haven't recovered from one, and then the next one kicks in and it just goes on and on. Okay.
Exactly. And that's what then a lot of times when we're seeing a wellness impact come out in someone's life, where we would say, okay, now if you see someone, which I've literally been seeing just this past week, adults physically fighting in the street. Okay, it's always more than just what we see.
Right.
What has accumulated in that person's life? And now we're seeing it come out, in terms of aggression. So that's a wellness impacts, even literally the decisions we make, how we're able to process pain that comes our way. So okay, now if I'm dealing with the fact that I lost my home because of the pandemic, fell out of status, let's say immigrant. Now, okay, you at the point where you realize, then you find out that your aunt died. Now you go to the store, you're just trying to park, get in the store so you can grab some stockings for the funeral, right?
Mm-hmm.
But someone cuts you off and get the parking spot
Mm-hmm.
instead of you. Now you get out the car, you are completely losing it.
Mm-hmm.
You're irate, you're irrational. You can't even, at that point, you can't process, okay, well, wait a minute. This is just someone that did not see me parked here because of all of the accumulated grief that's
Right.
happening, that you're dealing with. That was very traumatizing. And like I said, I just yesterday had to break up a very similar incident with two women that were in the parking lot, cheek to cheek with one of the ladies, trying to encourage her, sis, just get in the car, sis, just go. Sis, the other lady clearly has some mental challenges that she's dealing
Right.
with. And they were going at it, Dr. Ungo. And threatening to pull out guns. And, that is a part, though, of what we are dealing with in our society. That is not just an issue of a parking spot. Clearly.
There's more to it. I was reading a book recently that talked about aggression being arising as a result of frustrations, just unresolved frustrations that
Yeah.
eventually lead to aggression.
Yeah.
So I think, and I've talked to a lot of guests on the podcast. I think a lot of things that people have to be aware of is just that, I guess, shall I say awareness, or insight. Insight is the word.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being able to stop and have the wherewithal to have insight on a situation happening and say, okay, this is happening because something else happened, because something else
Mm-hmm.
happened. So really getting down to the root cause of that frustration and resolving that frustration before it festers into aggression.
Right, exactly. And honestly, for many, of our people and dealing with so much compounded grief and trauma, that process that you just explained, that cognitive process is not something that's always so readily accessible in the moment, because once you're in a hyperaroused state, your executive functioning is out the door. And so, but that is the reason why, having podcasts like this, talking about this, and been able to share at least. So once you have, I know for me, once you give me a word and I'm like, oh, that's what I'm dealing with,
Right.
oh, okay, so oh, this is grief that is going on with me. That helps me. Oh, okay, this may be something, this is a trauma that I'm facing and dealing with. Okay, because again, grief is, as we would even define it in the schools, all those things that happens to us emotionally, all of the behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that happens to us after someone has died. And so sometimes we don't realize, like, that is grief. That's not just, as we say, that child drawl and don't want to listen. No, that's grief. And so, as you mentioned, and then you have, different type of trauma. You have acute, we talked about, that can be a car accident happening, more like an incident that happens. Then you also have complex trauma, childhood, what has happened in the childhood that's unresolved, as you mentioned. And then you have racial trauma. NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, declared May 2020 that racism is a public health crisis. And so racial trauma is simply, what we experience based on our ethnicity, racial bias, racism, what a culture may experience. And so those are some of the key ones. And as I mentioned, it can impact us physically in our bodies, how we carry. We literally carry, it's just like, when you're stressed and you notice like your shoulders, like you don't realize. I know for me, like, I'm like, whoa, I've been tensing up like one time I was working so hard trying to complete something and I got up and I'm like, oh my God, my knees, but I didn't realize my knees was tightening. I was sitting down, but it was like my whole lower body was real tight. And so, just like when we stress, we may get a headache, you may feel it in your chest. Same thing, moving grief out of our body, because physically it impacts us, our sleep, our eating. Spiritually, it can cause us to question our faith, question a higher being. It can also impact us emotionally, where we're literally swinging from one emotion to the other. and it can impact us socially, you know, how we relate, connect, the frequency of how we do that, with people romantically, family, strangers. And then just mentally, you know, it can cause a lot of the strain on our whole, you know, thought process, our whole ability, you know, to be able to deal and balance with the different challenges that's happening in life. And that's why I take a more holistic approach, healing based, very humanistic approach, non-pathological, with grief and with trauma, because it could be any of us, you know, has been any of us, some of us. And so I just try to always approach it from that perspective.
You shared a lot of useful content, and I'm sure the viewers are really going to find listening to this podcast or watching this episode on YouTube beneficial to them. So I was going to ask you to share one pearl of wisdom, or share a book or audiobook or something that the audience can benefit from.
Sure. I will say a good book. I'll share a book, and then I will share an upcoming Courageous Healing Conversation community wellness support workshop that I'm doing in collaboration with Caribbean Community in Philadelphia, that the guests we're doing it next Tuesday on the 19th. On Zoom. If you know Dr. Ngozi persons are interested, because it's confidential, you can let me know and I can send you that link. And then the following Tuesday in person on the 26th, that we'll be doing is just an hour. And so I will just flash that as I'm speaking. I'll just go ahead and share that, and then I'll share a good book that I think the listeners could benefit from. I just need. All right, here we go. This is what I meant to share. So you'll see here, this is Tuesday, July 19th, virtual via Zoom, and then Tuesday, July 26th, in person. And it is going to be at Newlands Health Clinic, 6 p.m. to 7. So African-centered healing practices, as we talked about, you know, being able to learn how to move things through our body, talking about things from a village perspective. You know, we cannot do this alone. I'll be hosting this also in collaboration with African Diaspora Health Initiative. So I wanted to share this as one way further on maybe some things that they've heard. And then one good book is My Body Keeps Score. Okay. If you have not heard of that, and let me get the pronunciation of that real quick, of his name, because I kind of mess it up, but it really looks at trauma and how trauma is in our body and impacts us. So that was one of like a big top seller. And I'm going to get the name for you real quick. The Body Keeps the Score. And it is written by Bessel van der Kolk, doctor, but was a therapist. So that's B as in boy, E as in eggs, SS, E as in eggs, L as in Larry. Second word, van, like driving a van. Okay. Der, D-E-R, other word, and Kolk, K-O-L-K. Okay.
That's fantastic. So where can people find you on social media?
Sure. So I'm on my page, Coming Out More Equipped Consulting Services. You can look up other work that I've done in the community, doing a lot of frontline work with the protesters, doing Black Wellness Resiliency Zones, all those things and more. And what's coming up is there. That's again, Coming Out More Equipped Consulting Services. And then also email Lamya, Lamya, K, B as in boy, the number 1 at gmail.com if there's any questions or inquiries about speaking engagement or anything like that.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to share that in the show notes with your permission. I'll share your email and I'll put up the links to your Facebook page. So I'll put that in the show notes. Awesome. So this was wonderful and very informative. I want to thank you so much, Lamya, for taking the time to come on Health for Naija podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome, and have a wonderful day.
Yes, you too.